Around 70,000 years ago, something happened. We don't know exactly what. We don't know exactly when. We don't know if it happened on a Tuesday or across 1,000 Tuesdays spread over a generation, or whether calling it a day is even the right frame. But in the archaeological record, something changed. Before it, simple tools, no art, no jewelry, no long-distance trade, no evidence of symbolic thought. Communities that lived and died within a small radius, leaving behind almost nothing that suggests a mind reflecting on itself. After it, cave paintings of extraordinary sophistication, bone flutes, carved figurines, beads made from shells carried hundreds of kilometers from the coast, burials with grave goods, tools designed for tools, plans that extended beyond the immediate moment. The same species, the same brain size, something fundamentally different about what that brain was doing. Researchers call this the cognitive revolution, or the creative explosion, or the Great Leap Forward. Whatever you call it, it poses one of the deepest questions in human science. What exactly changed, and why then? The answer is still being argued. But the leading theories point towards something that most people take completely for granted: language, not speech. Hominins had been producing sounds for hundreds of thousands of years before this. Language, the ability to string symbols together into an unlimited number of combinations, to describe things that don't exist yet, to share an imagined future with another person, to say, if we go east at dawn and you carry the spears while I drive the herd toward the cliff, we will eat tonight. That sentence requires tense. It requires pronouns. It requires the concept of a plan. It requires the assumption that the other person can model the future scenario you are describing. No animal on Earth, other than humans after the cognitive revolution, can hold that sentence and act on it. Linguistic anthropologist Daniel Everett has argued that the key was not just the biological capacity for language, but the invention of a specific kind of symbol, a sign that could refer to something absent, something imagined, something that did not yet exist. That capacity for displacement, for talking and thinking about things beyond the immediate here and now, may be the single development that separated the before from the after. But language doesn't explain everything, because the biological machinery for language was probably already in place well before the cognitive revolution happened. The FOXP2 gene, often called the language gene, is associated with the fine motor control needed for speech. Neanderthals carried the same version of FOXP2 that modern humans carry. They had the same basic vocal anatomy. They almost certainly had some form of complex communication. But the cave paintings are not in Neanderthal sites. The carved figurines were not made by Neanderthals. The long-distance trade networks were not theirs. Something beyond biology was required. Richard Klein, a paleoanthropologist at Stanford University, has proposed that the trigger was a specific genetic mutation, a rewiring of neural connections that enabled the kind of open-ended, combinatorial, recursive thinking that produces both language and art and planning simultaneously. Klein calls this the Sapient Paradox. The paradox is this: human brains were essentially modern in structure by about 200,000 years ago. But the behavioral evidence of modern intelligence, the art, the symbols, the complex planning, doesn't appear clearly until around 40 to 70,000 years ago. A gap of 130,000 years minimum between the hardware and the software. What was the brain doing during all that time? One answer comes from Robin Dunbar, a psychologist at the University of Oxford, who has spent decades studying the relationship between brain size and social group size across primates. Dunbar's social brain hypothesis proposes that the human brain didn't get large primarily to solve environmental problems. It got large to manage social complexity, keeping track of who owes whom a favor, understanding how relationships between third parties affect your own standing, modeling what other people know, want, and believe, what psychologists call theory of mind. Dunbar calculated that the size of the neocortex across primate species predicts the average size of the social group that species can maintain. For humans, that number comes out at approximately 150. Not coincidentally, that is roughly the size of the functional social communities observed across hunter-gatherer societies, military units, and early villages in the archaeological record. The number is now called Dunbar's number. It is the cognitive ceiling for relationships a human brain can actively track. These cognitive skills, not tool use, not hunting strategy, were the primary driver of encephalization, the expansion of the brain's computing power across primate evolution. By this account, the brain that eventually produced art and language had been quietly developing its social processing hardware for millions of years. What the cognitive revolution represented was the moment those social capacities crossed a threshold and became generative. They began producing outputs that went beyond the social domain and into symbol, story, and imagination. There is another theory, and it starts with fire. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard University, has argued that cooking was the single most important event in human cognitive evolution. Cooking breaks down the cellular structure of food, releasing nutrients that would otherwise pass through the gut undigested. The result is a dramatic increase in caloric return from the same raw materials. That caloric surplus funded the brain's enormous energy demands. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy at rest. That is wildly disproportionate for an organ that represents about 2% of body weight. Without the caloric efficiency of cooked food, that energy budget may have been simply unavailable. Wrangham traces the beginning of regular fire use to roughly 1.8 million years ago, and he argues that the brain expansion visible in Homo erectus shortly afterward is not a coincidence. The cooking fires came first. The bigger brains followed. But even Wrangham's theory doesn't fully explain the sudden behavioral explosion at 70,000 years ago. The brain had been growing for nearly 2 million years by that point. Why did the creative explosion happen when it did, and not earlier or later? The most compelling answer may be the most unsatisfying one. Thresholds. Complex systems don't change gradually and then declare themselves transformed. They change gradually, incrementally, invisibly, and then cross a threshold at which the accumulated changes produce something qualitatively new. Water is cold, then colder, then ice. Language may have worked the same way. Smaller, incremental gains in symbolic capacity, a new word here, a new grammatical structure there, accumulating over tens of thousands of years until the system crossed a point at which it became fully recursive, fully generative, capable of expressing unlimited new thoughts from a finite set of pieces. At that point, the mind that had always been there became a different kind of tool. And everything that followed, the art, the music, the mythology, the agriculture, the cities, the science, the technology, is downstream of that single invisible threshold crossing. We didn't wake up intelligent. We inched toward it for 2 million years, and then one generation, possibly one community, possibly one genetic accident, crossed a line that no species had ever crossed before. And on the other side of that line was everything. The paintings on the cave walls at Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira were not the beginning of human art. They were the announcement that something had already happened. The people who painted those animals on those walls already had mythology, story, music, and a concept of the sacred. The paintings were not a primitive first step. They were the product of minds that had already fully crossed the threshold. Something nobody planned, something nobody understood, something that is still, right now, trying to understand itself.